to episode 4 of For Ilyse. Say hello, stuffed animals. Alright, snuggle in, it's story time. So, when I first decided to tell you the story of Saint Philomena, it was pretty random. I just felt like you would want to know about Saint Philomena. And I had never heard of Saint Philomena. All I ever had seen of her was a very pretty picture. Let me see if I can pull it up. Turns out, Saint Philomena is possibly one of the weirdest saint stories out there. Not so much the story of her life. That's pretty ordinary. As Roman Virgin martyrs go, she's almost exactly like all of them. Only difference really is how they got killed. But what's weird about Saint Philomena is that we don't have any historical documentation from anybody that actually knew her. The only physical evidence that she exists is a name on a tomb that was discovered hundreds of years after people started, out of the blue, praying to Saint Philomena. And the devotion to Saint Philomena started hundreds of years after she died. What happened, and this is very unusual, but I think it fits in with a lot of what you've been getting into recently. Saint Philomena appeared to a nun in Italy several hundred years after she died. This nun told the story that she saw in a vision, and people have taken that as the true story of Saint Philomena, about whom they know nothing apart from these stories told by this nun. Isn't that kind of crazy? But I mean, if you're into magical figures and legends, everything that we believe about the life of Saint Philomena literally comes from a mystical vision of someone coming back from the dead hundreds of years later. And a lot of the reason why people pray to Saint Philomena today is that there are several, more recently documented miracles that Saint Philomena has done because people called on her name, people asked her to pray for a miracle, or people touched her relics. The most famous is the miracle of Mugnano, spelled Mugnano, where a nun was cured of heart disease, some kind of really serious heart disease that was going to kill her. And to this day, the relics of Saint Philomena, relics are like basically body parts. I mean, this is weird, but it's not any weirder than a lot of the stuff that you may have seen in witchcraft type things either. People save body parts of saints. Sometimes it's bone fragments or hair or clothing. I don't know what they have of Saint Philomena, because this is talking hundreds of years after she was dead that anyone ever found her tomb. But anyway, her relics are in the Church of, I believe, Our Lady of Grace. I'll double check that. In Mugnano, Italy. Mugnano. So, the story of Saint Philomena, as told in a mystical vision given to Sister, oh bother, I forgot her name, but some random Italian nun a few hundred years ago. Once upon a time, there was a Greek princess whose father was one of the small kings of Greece. Philomena's father became a Christian. And Philomena did too. And when Philomena was 13 years old, she took a vow to remain a virgin for God forever. Now, pause. It sounds pretty weird to take a vow at 13 years old, but there's one thing you need to know about the culture in these times. From the Roman times, possibly earlier, but definitely through the Roman times and also the Middle Ages, it was very common for girls to be married off around roughly age 12 to 14. And while I don't agree with that, I don't think it's the right thing to do, it was the accepted norm. If she would have waited until she was 18, like a girl today, to take a vow, she would not have been given the option to take a vow. She would have been married off already. If a girl wanted to have a choice what she was going to do in her own life, she had to make that decision before she was 13, before she was 12 in many cases. And so those girls who did stand up for themselves, the consequences were terrible. I mean, really terrible. They would be tortured, they would be killed. It was very rare. But those few women who stood up for themselves and made their own decision about what they were going to do in their life and took the consequences, which meant their life was over, were usually young Christian girls who took a vow to remain a virgin for Christ when they were about 12 or 13 years old. It just meant that much to them for whatever reason, and I felt it too, although I was a lot older when I did. Sometimes you just can't do what your parents or whoever's in charge of your life is trying to force you to do. Sometimes it's just so important to who you were created to be that you have to make your own decision, and you know what that decision has to be, and it's worth it all. And that was what Saint Philomena, when she was 13 years old, decided to do. I actually myself tried to take a vow of virginity when I was 11 years old. Not because I was going to be married off, but because I wanted to do something for God. And I asked my mother's advice about it, and it's one of the few times she's given me really good advice. She said, don't take that vow. You're 11 years old, you shouldn't be taking a vow. And while there have been some saints, quite a few saints who have taken vows that early in life, and many of them died for it within a year, those of us who have to actually live for many years after taking a vow, most of us shouldn't take vows when we're children. Because, for example, I didn't even know what a virgin was. Weird upbringing. I wasn't allowed to think about it, so I didn't actually know what I would have been vowing to. And really, for most people, 11 or 12 is too young. But okay, Philomena does it. Here we go. So, Philomena and her father traveled to Rome. In Rome, Philomena's father was trying to make political peace with the Roman Empire. Remember, he was a king. The Emperor Diocletian saw Philomena, this 13-year-old girl, and as was typical for, 40 or 50-year-old men in those days, he fell in love with her and said, I want to marry this girl. Philomena, very unusual in these times, said no. If you think about why a girl in those times would say no at the cost of her life, there's two things that come to mind. One is that she's taken a vow, but she's also underage and shouldn't be held to that vow. But the other thing is we're talking about the Emperor Diocletian. Emperors in those days had multiple wives. And it is actually against church teaching as a young Catholic girl. It's not a valid marriage if you marry someone who's already who already has a living husband or wife. So this girl, Philomena, was going to be forced into a marriage with a king who presumably had 10 or 20 other wives. That was common in those days. And this marriage wouldn't have been a valid marriage. She would have been living in sin. Just the same, if you can imagine having the courage at 13 years old to give up your life in order to refuse to marry a bloodthirsty king. Boy, did it cost. Philomena was then killed, but not quickly. First, she was scourged, meaning whipped. Now, in those days, wife-beating was actually quite common. I got this from the Confessions of St. Augustine. It was a normal thing for men to beat their wives if they didn't agree with the way their wives were acting. It was so accepted that Augustine didn't even think there was anything wrong with it. Not because the Catholic Church agrees with that, we don't, but because it was the cultural norm among the Roman people at the time. So, anyways, this was a step further than that. He wasn't just beating her, he was beating her with whips, and you could potentially die the way the Romans would. Under a Roman scourging, some people would actually bleed to death. Saint Philomena was cured because angels came down from heaven and touched her with their angelic hands and healed her. Then Philomena was drowned with an anchor attached to her neck. And again, angels came down from heaven. They pulled her up out of the ocean and they healed her. And Philomena was shot with arrows. And again, angels came from heaven and they touched her with their angelic hands and they healed her. Finally, the emperor decided to have her decapitated. And it's said that she was killed on Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is the same time Jesus died. And many of the saints longed to be like Jesus in any way they could. Well, it's a strange life and a strange story of how we've come to know anything about St. Philomena. But since then, there are actually a lot of miracles that St. Philomena has done, or that people believe are done by St. Philomena and her relics. Let me check on some of the information on. So I just checked. St. Philomena has cured cancer. She has cured wounds. And the most famous one was that she cured someone of a heart issue. Man, I forgot her name again, the lady that she cured of a heart issue. But anyways, Pauline Jaricot was cured of a heart problem. Anyways, St. Philomena, so one thing about miracles performed by saints is that saints can do wonders, but they only do good things. They heal people, but they never hurt them. They make people's lives better, but they never make their life worse. So if you're interested in those kinds of wonders and miracles and your gods aren't working for you, try St. Philomena.